James Carter was a respected federal prosecutor, known for his calm demeanor and sharp mind. He had spent years building a reputation for fairness and justice, handling some of the toughest cases. On this particular day, James was driving through a quiet southern town on his way to a legal conference. The weather was warm, and the sun shone brightly, casting golden rays on the small, picturesque streets lined with old oak trees. The town seemed peaceful, but James couldn't shake an odd feeling as he passed through. He noticed that people on the sidewalk stared at him a little too long, their eyes following his car. He brushed it off, telling himself he was overthinking things. After all, he was just passing through and wouldn't be staying long. As James drove, his thoughts wandered to the upcoming conference. It was an important event, and he had been asked to deliver a speech on upholding justice and integrity in the legal system. He was looking forward to it. Then, out of the corner of his eye, James noticed the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing him. Confused, he glanced at his dashboard. He wasn't speeding, and his car was in perfect condition. Why was he being pulled over? James sighed and pulled his car to the side of the road. He reached into his glove compartment to retrieve his license and registration, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. His heart raced slightly, not out of fear, but because he knew how unpredictable these situations could be. A tall, stern-looking officer stepped out of the police car and approached James' window. The officer, whose badge read Hensley, had a sharp, cold expression. James rolled down his window and greeted the officer politely. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" James asked, keeping his tone calm. "You've got a broken taillight," the officer replied curtly, though James knew for a fact that his car was in perfect condition. "Are you sure?" "I just had my car inspected last week," James said politely, offering his documents to the officer. But instead of taking the papers, Officer Hensley crossed his arms and leaned closer to James. His tone shifted, becoming sharper. "What are you doing around here? You don't look like you're from this town." James blinked, surprised by the question. "I'm on my way to a conference," he replied, staying calm. "I'm a federal prosecutor." The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced back at James' car, and then at James himself, as if trying to find something wrong. James could feel the tension building, but he maintained his composure. The encounter was starting to feel strange, and James' instincts told him this wasn't going to be a routine stop. Something wasn't right, and James knew he had to tread carefully. James Carter kept his hands visible on the steering wheel as the officer, Hensley, continued to look at him with a sharp, unwelcoming gaze. James had been through plenty of tense situations in his career as a federal prosecutor, but this felt different. Something about the officer's tone and body language set him on edge. "Where exactly is this conference?" Officer Hensley asked, his voice clipped. "In the city, about an hour from here," James replied calmly. "I'm just passing through." Hensley didn't seem satisfied. He took a step back and looked over James' car, slowly circling it as if searching for a reason to keep the stop going. James glanced at his rearview mirror and saw another police cruiser pull up behind Hensley's car. Another officer stepped out, but unlike Hensley, this one seemed more relaxed. James remained seated, knowing better than to make any sudden moves. He had learned from his years in the legal system that staying calm and cooperative was the best way to handle situations like this. Hensley returned to the window, his expression still stern. "You said you're a federal prosecutor?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of disbelief. "Yes, sir," James replied, reaching for his wallet to show his identification. He held it out to Hensley, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. The officer examined the ID carefully, as if expecting to find something wrong. "You don't look like any prosecutor I've met," Hensley muttered under his breath, but it was loud enough for James to hear. James felt his jaw tighten, but didn't respond. He knew it was better to let the comment go. The second officer, who had been standing by the other cruiser, now approached. "What's going on here?" The second officer asked Hensley, his tone neutral. "Routine stop," Hensley replied, waving him off. "I've got it under control." The second officer looked at James, then at the ID in Hensley's hand. "That's a federal badge," he said, his voice carrying a note of caution. Hensley frowned but didn't reply. He handed the ID back to James and leaned closer to the window. "You sure you're just passing through?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "Yes, officer," James said firmly but politely. "Is there something else I can help you with?" For a moment, there was silence. Hensley stared at James, and James could feel the tension in the air. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that something wasn't right about the way Hensley was handling the situation. Finally, Hensley stepped back. "Stay here," he said, walking back to his car. James watched him go, his instincts telling him this wasn't over yet. Something about Hensley's attitude felt personal, and James couldn't help but wonder why the officer was pushing so hard. As the seconds ticked by, James stayed calm, knowing that whatever happened next, he would handle it with the same composure and professionalism he always did. James waited in his car, his hand still resting on the steering wheel. He glanced over at the rearview mirror, watching Officer Hensley as he spoke with the second officer by their cruisers. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he knew he had to stay calm. Something about this situation didn't sit right with him. The officer's attitude was off, and he had a feeling it wasn't just about the traffic stop. The seconds ticked by slowly, stretching the tension between them. Then Hensley turned back and began walking toward James again. This time, his expression was colder, more determined. He stopped a few feet from the window, his face tense. "I need you to step out of the vehicle," Hensley ordered, his voice sharp. James raised an eyebrow, surprised by the request. "Why?" "I've already shown you my ID. There's no reason to step out of my car." Hensley didn't answer directly. Instead, he leaned down toward the window. "I said, step out of the car," he repeated, his tone even colder now. James' heart raced a little faster. He had been in tense situations before, but this felt different. The officer's insistence was unusual, and it raised an alarm in his mind. He had been taught to trust his instincts, and everything in him was telling him that this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. There was more going on here. "I'm not getting out unless you can tell me why," James said, keeping his voice steady. He had every right to refuse, especially since he had done nothing wrong. His calm but firm response was meant to make Hensley think twice. Hensley's eyes narrowed. Without saying another word, he suddenly reached for his holster and pulled out his gun. James froze. The sudden motion caught him completely off guard. The officer's gun was now pointed directly at James, just inches away from the open window. James could see the tension in the officer's arm, the way his finger was near the trigger. His pulse quickened, but he stayed perfectly still. "Get out of the car now," Hensley shouted, his voice filled with anger. James' mind raced. He knew he had to remain calm. He couldn't let fear control him. Taking a deep breath, James carefully kept his hands in view, not wanting to give Hensley any excuse to escalate the situation further. "Listen," James said, his voice steady. "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not a threat to you. I'm a federal prosecutor, and I'm not going anywhere without a good reason." He spoke slowly and clearly, hoping to diffuse the situation before it got worse. Hensley's eyes remained cold, the gun still aimed at James. The seconds felt like hours. James could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to let fear take over. He couldn't show weakness, not now. The second officer, who had been standing back, suddenly moved forward, his face filled with concern. "Hensley, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice trembling. James seized the opportunity to speak again. "Please, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't necessary." But the tension in the air was thick, and James knew it was only a matter of time before things could spiral out of control. The tension in the air felt almost unbearable. James kept his eyes on Officer Hensley's gun, still pointed directly at him. He had been in dangerous situations before, but nothing like this. His mind raced as he thought about his options, but the only thing he could focus on was keeping calm. The officer's hostile energy made it clear that this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It had escalated, and James had to be careful. Then, just as the situation seemed about to break into something far worse, James noticed movement from the rearview mirror. Another police car had pulled up behind Hensley's vehicle. James' heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he wasn't sure whether it was good or bad news. The new officer stepped out of the second cruiser, and James noticed that this officer was different. She wasn't acting as aggressively as Hensley had been. Instead, her expression seemed calm, even concerned. The new officer, who wore a more relaxed stance, made her way toward the two of them. "Everything okay here, Robert?" she asked, her voice soft, but with authority. Hensley, still with his gun raised, barely glanced at her. "Stay back, officer. I've got this under control," he snapped, his words sharp as ever. But the second officer didn't back away. She stepped forward slowly, her gaze shifting between James and Hensley. "This isn't necessary," she said, her voice level and firm. "Put the weapon down, Robert. We're just here to help." James felt a brief moment of relief. He recognized the tone in the second officer's voice. She wasn't looking to escalate the situation further. She was trying to calm things down. Hensley's grip tightened on the gun, but he didn't respond. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. James kept his hands visible, trying to remain as non-threatening as possible. His heart still raced, but he knew he had to stay composed. Finally, the second officer stepped in closer, positioning herself between James and Hensley. She raised her hand slightly, signaling for James to remain calm. "Robert, please. This is a federal prosecutor," she said, her tone softer. "We don't need to make this worse." At the mention of James' job, Hensley's posture stiffened, but he didn't lower his weapon. He looked over at James, his expression conflicted. The mention of James' status seemed to shake him, but it didn't immediately stop the dangerous tension in the air. "Stay back, Leela," Hensley muttered, his voice still filled with anger. "This doesn't concern you." James, trying to stay focused on the bigger picture, slowly exhaled, hoping the situation would diffuse without escalating. The second officer, Leela, turned to James, giving him a brief nod. She was buying time. Time that James desperately needed to remain in control. "I'm not a threat," James said, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You don't need that weapon. Just let's talk this out." Leela didn't take her eyes off Hensley. "Robert, this can't go on," she said gently. The air felt thick with uncertainty. James couldn't predict what would happen next, but he hoped that Leela's intervention would be enough to stop the situation from getting out of hand. The tension in the air began to settle as Officer Leela stood firmly between James and Hensley. Her calm presence seemed to diffuse the immediate danger, but James knew the situation wasn't over yet. He glanced at her, hoping she could help bring the standoff to a peaceful end. Slowly, Hensley lowered his gun, though his expression remained tight and suspicious. "Let's just get this over with," Hensley muttered, stepping back from the car. He didn't say another word before returning to his cruiser. James stayed in his seat for a few moments, making sure the situation was truly diffused. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but the immediate threat was gone. He had no idea what had caused Officer Hensley to react like this, but he knew he had to stay calm. Leela turned to James, her eyes full of concern. "I'm really sorry about that," she said softly. "I don't know what got into him, but I'm glad you stayed calm." James took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Thank you for stepping in," he said. He wasn't sure what would have happened if she hadn't arrived. "I don't understand why he was so aggressive." Leela looked back at Hensley's cruiser, her face showing signs of frustration. He's got his issues, but I don't think that's an excuse. I'm going to report this." She looked back at James and gave him a serious look. "This isn't over." James nodded again, his mind spinning. He had been through enough in his career to know that things like this didn't just go away. He was a federal prosecutor, and the fact that he'd been treated like this in a small town wasn't something he could ignore. After a few more minutes of conversation, Leela made sure James was safe to go on his way. She apologized once more and promised to take care of the paperwork. As James drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the afternoon were far from over. Back in the city, James immediately contacted his colleagues. His mind raced as he recounted the entire encounter, including the officer's behavior, the gun drawn, and his own calm handling of the situation. He had made it through without injury, but that didn't mean there weren't serious questions to answer. He knew he couldn't just forget what had happened. Soon, news of the incident began to spread. James was a respected figure in the legal community, and his colleagues quickly offered their support. But there was more to this story than just a simple misunderstanding. James had to take action. He wasn't going to let this incident slide, no matter how many people tried to downplay it. The public also took notice. People began to ask questions about what had really happened during the traffic stop. Was Hensley's behavior a one-off, or was there a larger issue at play? The wheels of justice began turning quickly, and the story started to gain traction in local news outlets. James knew this wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had always fought for justice, and now he would have to fight for it in a whole new way. The weeks following the traffic stop were tense for James. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The police department had initially tried to brush off the incident, but the news of Officer Hensley's actions spread quickly. James wasn't the type to stay silent when something wasn't right, especially when it involved abuse of power. He knew he had to push forward, no matter how uncomfortable the situation might get. Soon, a formal investigation was launched into Officer Hensley's conduct. James, as a federal prosecutor, worked with his colleagues to ensure the case was taken seriously. The first step was to gather all the evidence: the dashcam footage from the police car, witness testimonies, and James' own detailed account of the stop. It was clear from the video that Hensley had acted aggressively without cause, pointing a gun at James for no reason at all. As the case moved forward, the local community was divided. Some people supported the officer, claiming he had been under pressure and simply doing his job. Others, like James, saw the truth behind the actions, a clear abuse of authority driven by something darker. The trial was set, and the courtroom became the stage for what would turn into a battle for justice. James knew that it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter who they were. The trial wasn't just about Officer Hensley. It was about ensuring that those in power couldn't act without consequences. On the first day of the trial, James sat in the courtroom, prepared to testify. He had been through many cases in his career, but this one felt different. The room was filled with reporters, activists, and concerned citizens. They had come to hear what happened, to understand why something as simple as a routine traffic stop had turned into an explosive situation. James took the stand, his hand steady despite the gravity of the situation. He explained everything that had happened that day: the way Hensley had pulled him over without cause, the officer's rude and hostile behavior, and the moment the gun had been drawn. He was calm as he spoke, careful with his words, making sure to stay focused on the facts. The defense tried to argue that the situation had been a misunderstanding, that Officer Hensley had felt threatened and had acted out of fear. But the evidence was too strong. The dashcam footage clearly showed that James hadn't posed any threat. In fact, it showed the officer acting out of anger, pointing the gun without any reason. As the days of the trial went by, James watched as more evidence came to light. Hensley had a history of complaints about his behavior, but nothing had ever been done. James realized that this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was part of a pattern of abuse, and it was something that had to stop. The prosecution, led by one of James' trusted colleagues, presented the case with precision. The jury listened carefully, and James could see the tide turning. They weren't going to let this officer off the hook. As the trial continued, the news of Officer Hensley's actions spread far beyond the courtroom. James had known the case would attract attention, but the level of public outrage surprised even him. People from all over the country began to speak out, demanding justice for what had happened during that fateful traffic stop. Social media was flooded with posts about the incident. Hashtags like #JusticeForJames and #EndPoliceAbuse trended across platforms as thousands of people shared their own stories of unfair treatment by law enforcement. Some spoke of their own experiences with racial profiling, while others expressed their shock at the officer's actions. The support for James grew stronger every day. At the same time, there were those who stood behind Officer Hensley, a small group of local residents, some of whom had known him for years, defended his actions. They argued that Hensley had acted in the heat of the moment, and that the situation had been misinterpreted. They claimed that he was simply trying to protect himself from a potential threat. But for James, this was not just about one officer's behavior. It was about the broader issue of accountability and the abuse of power that had gone unchecked for far too long. In the midst of this growing public debate, James took a stand. He knew that the spotlight on him would only get brighter as the trial went on, but he refused to back down. He continued to speak out, sharing his belief that justice could only be served if those in power were held responsible for their actions. He spoke to reporters, participated in interviews, and even gave a public statement about the importance of fairness and accountability in law enforcement. "I'm not doing this for myself," James said during one of his interviews. "This is about making sure something like this doesn't happen to anyone else. This is about making sure that the system works for everyone, not just a select few." James' words resonated with many. He became a symbol of courage, standing up not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been mistreated or unfairly targeted. Activists rallied behind him, and civil rights groups took up his cause. They organized protests, held rallies, and called for change. It was clear that the public had had enough of unchecked police power. But the support wasn't just from activists. Everyday citizens, people from all walks of life, came forward to express their belief that the officer should be held accountable. It wasn't about politics or personal agendas. It was about basic fairness. It was about making sure that no one, no matter their race, background, or status, should have to face what James had endured. For James, this support meant everything. It gave him the strength to keep going, to keep fighting for justice. He knew that even if the outcome of the trial wasn't what he hoped for, the movement that had begun could make a real difference in the world. The voices of so many people had come together to demand change, and that, in itself, was a victory. After weeks of intense testimony and mounting public pressure, the day of the verdict finally arrived. The courtroom was filled with tension as everyone waited to hear what the jury would decide. James sat quietly in his seat, his hands clasped together, his mind racing. He had lived through the trial. But now the hardest part was yet to come. The courtroom was filled with people who had followed the case closely. Reporters filled the back rows, eager to get the latest news. Activists who had supported James from the very beginning sat in the gallery, their faces hopeful. Everyone had come to see whether justice would be served. The judge stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman of the jury stood up and nodded. "We have, Your Honor." A hush fell over the room. James could feel his heart beating faster as the foreman held up the piece of paper with the jury's decision. The judge took the paper and read it aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Hensley, guilty of aggravated assault and misconduct while on duty." The words hit James like a wave of relief. He had expected this moment to feel different, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming sense of justice that washed over him. There was a brief moment of silence before the courtroom erupted in applause. The people who had supported James cheered, some even standing in their seats. It was a bittersweet celebration, a victory for justice, but a reminder of the deep wounds that had been exposed. James sat still, his mind still processing the verdict. He knew it was a huge step forward, not just for him, but for the many others who had experienced similar treatment. But as the applause filled the room, James couldn't help but think about the many people who would never see justice in their own cases, who were still waiting for their moment in the spotlight. Hensley, the officer who had once held a gun to James' face, was now facing the consequences of his actions. He stood there in disbelief as the judge announced his sentence. "Robert Hensley, you are sentenced to 12 years in prison for your actions. You abused your authority, and now you will be held accountable." Hensley's face was pale as he was led away in handcuffs. The contrast between his cold, defiant attitude in the past and his defeated posture now was striking. For James, it wasn't about seeing the officer in prison. It was about the message this case sent, that no one, no matter their position or authority, was above the law. As the court proceedings came to a close, James felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This battle had been long and difficult, but it was worth it. His work wasn't finished, though. This case had opened up deeper conversations about the issues of justice and accountability, and James was determined to keep fighting for those who didn't have a voice. The verdict was a win, but James knew the real work would begin now, changing the system that allowed people like Hensley to act without fear of consequences. The trial was over, and the verdict had been delivered. James sat quietly in his office, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. Officer Hensley had been sentenced to 12 years in prison, and while it was a victory for justice, James couldn't shake the feeling that the journey was far from over. This case had exposed a deeper problem, one that went beyond one officer's actions. It had shown that there were cracks in the system that needed to be repaired. James knew that a single trial couldn't change everything. He had spent his career fighting for fairness, but he now understood how much work there still was to do. The victory in court was just the beginning. It was a symbol, a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated, but it was also a call to action. In the days that followed, James was flooded with messages of support. People reached out from all over the country, thanking him for standing up and speaking out. They shared their own stories of discrimination, of unjust treatment, and of the fear they had faced in similar situations. It was overwhelming, but it also reinforced why he had to keep pushing forward. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged, for every person whose voice had been silenced. At the same time, there were still many who resisted change. Some believed that the system didn't need fixing, that the problem was an isolated incident. James knew that those people were missing the bigger picture. The problem wasn't just about one officer. It was about a culture that allowed power to go unchecked, about a system that needed reform at every level. James used his newfound platform to speak out. He began working with civil rights organizations, law enforcement reform groups, and community leaders to advocate for real change. He pushed for better training for officers, stronger accountability measures, and systems that ensured fairness for everyone, regardless of their race or background. It wasn't going to be easy, but James was determined to keep going. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, and he was ready for the long road ahead. As the months passed, James' life began to return to some sense of normalcy, but he was changed. He had been through something that many people would never experience, and it had shaped his perspective in ways he couldn't ignore. The feeling of standing up against injustice, of making a difference, was something he would carry with him forever. James continued his work as a federal prosecutor, but now his focus was even sharper. He saw how important his role was in the larger picture. Every case he took on, every decision he made, had the potential to bring about real change. He had become more than just a prosecutor. He had become an advocate for fairness and equality. Looking back on the events of that day, James knew he had done the right thing. He had stood up when it mattered most, and he had helped bring about the change that was needed. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, James was confident that, together with others who shared his vision, they could make a lasting difference.